Tonight, we travel quietly back through time, to a world of stone roads and distant horizons, to a city that called itself eternal. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the edge of ancient Rome. The air is warm, touched by the Mediterranean sun. Before you stretch narrow streets paved in worn stone, smoothed by countless footsteps. Vendors speak softly in the marketplaces. The scent of olive oil and fresh bread lingers in the air. In the distance, the steady murmur of public life rises and falls like a gentle tide. This is Rome in the 1st century before the Common Era. It is not yet an empire, not yet ruled by emperors. It is a republic, a complex and fragile system of shared power, proud traditions, and quiet rivalries. And somewhere within this restless city, a child has been born into an old but not especially powerful family. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar. At the time of his birth, in 100 BCE, there was little to suggest that he would reshape Rome forever. The Republic had stood for centuries. Its institutions seemed strong. Its Senate commanded respect. Its generals fought wars far from home, returning in triumph beneath arches of carved stone. Yet beneath the surface, Rome was changing. The Republic had grown vast. Its territories stretched across Italy and far beyond. With expansion came wealth. With wealth came ambition. And with ambition came quiet tensions that stirred like distant thunder. To understand Caesar, we must first understand the world that shaped him. The Roman Republic was governed not by kings, but by elected officials. Each year, 2 consuls were chosen to lead. Beneath them stood a hierarchy of magistrates, praetors, quaestors, tribunes, each serving limited terms. Above them all stood the Senate, a body of aristocratic men who guided policy and guarded tradition. It was a system built on balance. But balance is delicate. Over time, powerful generals had begun to gather loyal armies not just to Rome, but to themselves. Soldiers, once citizens first, increasingly looked to their commanders for rewards, land, and protection. The loyalty of Rome's legions was slowly shifting. A generation before Caesar's rise, a man named Gaius Marius had reformed the Roman army, allowing landless citizens to enlist. This created opportunity, but also dependence. Soldiers now relied on their generals for pensions and land grants, and when generals competed, their soldiers followed. Not long after, another figure emerged, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Through a brutal civil conflict, Sulla marched on Rome itself, seizing control in a way previously unthinkable. He declared himself dictator and enacted harsh reforms before eventually retiring. Rome had witnessed something unsettling. A Roman general had turned his army against Rome. The precedent lingered in memory. Into this atmosphere of uneasy stability and quiet rivalry, Julius Caesar was born. He belonged to the gens Julia, an ancient patrician family who traced their lineage, as legend claimed, back to Aeneas of Troy and even to the goddess Venus herself. Whether these stories were believed literally mattered less than what they represented: prestige, ancestry, and a sense of destiny. Yet, despite their noble lineage, Caesar's branch of the family was not among the most powerful. His early life unfolded during years of political turbulence. As a young man, he witnessed the aftermath of Sulla's dictatorship. Proscriptions, official lists of enemies, had led to confiscated property and executions. Fear had brushed against the edges of Roman society. Caesar's own family connections placed him in a precarious position. Through marriage ties, he was associated with the faction opposed to Sulla. At one point, he was ordered to divorce his wife Cornelia, whose father had supported Marius. Caesar refused. It was a small act of defiance, but a revealing one. Rather than comply, he chose temporary exile. Friends intervened on his behalf, and eventually Sulla relented, though not without remarking, according to later historians, that there were many Mariuses in this young man. Whether those exact words were spoken, we cannot know with certainty, but they capture something essential. Even in youth, Caesar possessed a quiet determination that others noticed. As Rome moved cautiously forward after Sulla's retirement, Caesar began the slow climb through public life. His path would not be straightforward. It would require patience, calculation, and an understanding of how power moved beneath the formal structures of the Republic. But all of that still lay ahead. For now, Rome rests in uneasy balance. The Senate debates policy beneath marble columns. Ambitious men speak in the forum. Veterans remember past conflicts, and the young Caesar observes, listens, and learns. The city hums softly under the Italian sun. And history waits. As the young Julius Caesar grew into adulthood, the Roman Republic itself was passing through a period of quiet but unmistakable strain. From a distance, Rome appeared strong. Its territories stretched across much of the Mediterranean. Its armies had defeated Carthage, subdued Greece, and extended Roman authority deep into Spain, North Africa, and parts of Asia Minor. Wealth flowed steadily into the city: grain from Sicily and Egypt, silver from Iberia, tribute from conquered lands. The forum bustled with merchants, politicians, and petitioners. Marble temples gleamed in the sunlight. Triumphs were celebrated with solemn grandeur. Yet beneath this outward confidence, deeper currents were shifting. The Republic had been designed for a city-state, a compact community governed by shared tradition and a sense of civic duty. But Rome was no longer a city-state. It was the center of a sprawling network of provinces, cultures, and peoples. Managing such a vast domain required coordination, compromise, and restraint. Restraint was becoming harder to maintain. Power in the Republic depended on a careful balance between magistrates, the Senate, and the assemblies of the people. Offices were held for limited terms. Authority was divided deliberately. No one man was meant to hold too much control for too long. But ambition does not always remain confined within institutional boundaries. As Rome expanded, opportunities for personal advancement grew as well. Provincial governorships brought not only responsibility, but also immense wealth. Successful generals returned from distant campaigns with loyal troops and public acclaim. Military success became a powerful currency in Roman politics. The traditional aristocracy, known as the Optimates, sought to preserve the authority of the Senate and the customs of their ancestors. They believed stability depended on hierarchy and careful governance. Opposing them, in a looser sense, were those often described as the populares, politicians who appealed more directly to the popular assemblies and sought reforms that would benefit ordinary citizens, veterans, and the urban poor. These were not formal parties, but rather tendencies within Roman politics. The divide was subtle at first, but it widened gradually. Land distribution became a central issue. Many small farmers had lost their holdings during long military campaigns. Wealthy elites acquired vast estates worked by enslaved laborers. Veterans returned home to find their livelihoods diminished. Urban populations grew. Grain subsidies became essential to prevent unrest. Political speeches grew sharper. Rivalries deepened. Several decades before Caesar's rise, the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus had attempted land reforms intended to redistribute public land to struggling citizens. Their efforts were controversial. Both brothers met violent ends. Their deaths marked a troubling turning point. Political disagreement in Rome had crossed into bloodshed. While Rome continued to conquer abroad, internally it seemed less certain of itself. Generals, such as Marius and Sulla, had already demonstrated that armies could be instruments not only of foreign policy, but of domestic power. When Sulla marched on Rome in 88 BCE, he shattered a long-standing taboo. The city, once thought inviolable to its own legions, had been entered by force. Though Sulla eventually retired, his example lingered in memory. Young Julius Caesar came of age in this atmosphere, one where precedent had been broken, where loyalty could be redirected, and where personal ambition increasingly intersected with state authority. As he observed public life, he would have seen men navigating a delicate landscape of alliances and rivalries. Speeches in the Forum were not merely rhetorical exercises, they were strategic maneuvers in an ongoing contest for influence. The cursus honorum, the formal sequence of public offices, still structured political advancement. A young nobleman would begin as a quaestor, overseeing financial matters, then perhaps serve as a dial, organizing public games, or praetor, administering justice before aspiring to the consulship. Each step required support, reputation, and careful positioning. Caesar understood this structure well. He also understood something less formal but equally important, the power of public image. In a society where memory and honor carried immense weight, perception mattered deeply. Funerals of prominent citizens featured elaborate orations recounting ancestral achievements. Masks of distinguished forebears were displayed as symbols of lineage. The past was never far from the present. Caesar's own family claimed descent from Aeneas, the Trojan hero, said to have fled the fall of Troy and journeyed to Italy. Through Aeneas, legend connected the Julii to the goddess Venus. Whether such ancestry was believed literally mattered less than its symbolic value. It suggested destiny. Yet destiny alone did not secure power. Rome was a competitive arena. Even those of noble birth had to compete vigorously for recognition and advancement. As Caesar matured, he cultivated skills that would later define him: eloquence in speech, resilience in adversity, and a keen awareness of public sentiment. He studied rhetoric carefully. In Roman politics, persuasive speech was essential. A well-delivered oration could sway opinion, shape alliances, and elevate reputation. At the same time, Caesar displayed patience. He did not rush recklessly toward prominence. Instead, he observed the rhythms of political life, the ebb and flow of alliances, the subtle negotiations behind public debates. The Republic was not collapsing in these years. It continued to function. Elections were held, laws were passed, armies marched under official command, but the balance was fragile. Powerful individuals increasingly operated at the edges of established norms. Personal loyalty sometimes outweighed institutional loyalty. Wealth from provinces enabled ambitious men to fund games, public works, and favors that secured popular support. It was a system that rewarded both tradition and boldness. Caesar would eventually embody both. For now, though, he remained one figure among many, ambitious, intelligent, attentive. The streets of Rome continued their steady rhythm. Senators walked beneath porticos discussing policy. Citizens gathered to hear speeches. Veterans recounted campaigns fought in distant lands. And in the midst of it all, Julius Caesar prepared quietly for the long ascent ahead. The Republic, outwardly stable, carried within it the seeds of transformation. Transformation would not come all at once. It would unfold gradually through decisions, rivalries, and moments of quiet resolve, and Caesar would be at its center. As the Republic moved through its uneasy decades, Julius Caesar's early life unfolded within a household shaped by both dignity and restraint. He was born in July of the year 100 BCE into the ancient patrician family known as the gens Julia. Though the family traced its lineage to noble and even mythic origins, its immediate political influence was modest. The Julii were respected, but they were not among the most dominant families steering Rome's highest offices at the time. The Rome into which Caesar was born was a place of contradictions, magnificent yet troubled, powerful yet vulnerable. It was a republic, governed by laws and traditions that stretch back centuries, yet it was also a place where those same traditions were beginning to crack under their own weight. The marble temples gleamed in the fading light, but beneath their beauty lied a society struggling with questions about its own future. Caesar's father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, served as a praetor and later governed the province of Asia. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, came from a well-regarded family and was known for her intelligence and steady character. Ancient writers would later remark on her dignity and careful oversight of her household. In many ways, Aurelia's influence shaped the young Caesar profoundly. Roman mothers of elite families were entrusted not merely with domestic management, but with instilling discipline, values, and ambition in their children. Education in such households was rigorous. Boys learned reading, writing, rhetoric, and the foundational myths of Rome. They were taught to honor their ancestors, respect tradition, and pursue excellence in public life. Young Caesar grew up in the Subura, a densely populated district of Rome. Unlike the quiet villas of the most powerful elites, this neighborhood was lively, filled with the movement and sound of ordinary Roman life. Markets bustled, voices carried through narrow streets. The rhythms of the city were close at hand. Perhaps this environment gave Caesar an early familiarity with both aristocratic expectation and popular sentiment. As a boy, he would have absorbed stories of Rome's past triumphs, of the defeat of Hannibal, of the steadfast courage of early consuls, of the virtues that Roman society claimed as its foundation, gravitas, virtus, dignitas. But he also grew up in the shadow of political turbulence. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla had reshaped the Republic. Proscriptions, lists of political enemies marked for death or confiscation, had created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Families were divided. Loyalties were tested. Caesar's family connections placed him near the faction associated with Gaius Marius. Through marriage alliances, the Julii were connected to those who had opposed Sulla. This became significant when Sulla rose to dominance. In 84 BCE, at approximately 16 years of age, Caesar married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a prominent supporter of Marius and a political adversary of Sulla. The marriage was politically aligned and symbolically meaningful. Not long after, Sulla consolidated his power and began restructuring Rome according to his vision. As part of his efforts to weaken opposing factions, he targeted those connected to his former enemies. Caesar, still very young, was ordered to divorce Cornelia. It was a direct command from a man who had demonstrated willingness to enforce his authority with severity. Yet Caesar refused. It was a decision both personal and political. Divorce would have aligned him with Sulla's regime. Refusal meant risk. For a time, Caesar went into hiding. His priesthood, he had been appointed as Flamen Dialis, a high religious office, was stripped from him. His inheritance was threatened. He relied on friends and family connections to negotiate clemency. Eventually, Sulla relented, though not without hesitation. Later writers recount that Sulla is said to have warned that in this young man lay many future dangers. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, they suggest that Caesar's quiet defiance had been noticed. The episode marked one of his earliest tests. It revealed a willingness to endure hardship rather than submit entirely to political pressure. After Sulla's death in 78 BCE, the political landscape shifted once more. Caesar returned to public life more fully, though his position remained delicate. Rather than immediately seeking prominence in Rome, he left for military service in Asia Minor. There, he served under Marcus Minucius Thermus during campaigns against local uprisings. Military service was an essential step for any Roman nobleman seeking advancement. It provided experience, connections, and the possibility of distinction. During the siege of Mytilene, Caesar reportedly demonstrated bravery and was awarded the Civic Crown, one of Rome's highest military honors, for saving the life of a fellow soldier. Though accounts vary in detail, the honor itself indicates early recognition of courage. It was during this period that an episode occurred which would later become part of Caesar's legend. While traveling in the eastern Mediterranean, he was captured by pirates. Such piracy was not uncommon in those waters at the time. The pirates demanded ransom. According to later accounts, Caesar reacted not with fear, but with a curious mixture of composure and confidence. He reportedly joked with his captors, insisting they demand a higher ransom than they had initially requested, as he considered himself worth more. While awaiting payment, he is said to have behaved not as a prisoner, but as a temporary guest, reading aloud, composing poetry, and even lightly threatening the pirates that he would return to punish them once freed. When the ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar reportedly raised a small fleet, pursued the pirates, captured them, and had them executed. Whether embellished or entirely accurate, the story reflects traits that would later define him: boldness, calculated, resolve, and an almost serene self-assurance in uncertain circumstances. By his mid-20s, Caesar had gained both military experience and personal confidence. He returned to Rome prepared to begin the steady climb through the cursus honorum. He had endured exile, defied a dictator, served with distinction, and survived captivity. Yet he was still only at the beginning. Rome continued its restless rhythm. Elections came and went, senators debated, generals maneuvered for influence, and in the midst of this intricate political world, Julius Caesar, patient, observant, and quietly ambitious, prepared for the long ascent that would eventually reshape the Republic itself. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome after his early military service, the city he re-entered was no longer under the direct control of Sulla, yet the memory of Sulla's rule lingered like a faint imprint on stone. The dictatorship had formally ended. Sulla had resigned his extraordinary powers and retired, before his death in 78 BCE. Yet his reforms remained embedded in the Republic's structure. The Senate had been strengthened, the powers of the popular tribunes had been curtailed. The political system, at least in theory, had been restored to stability. But memories do not fade quickly. The generation that had witnessed proscriptions and civil conflict had learned that power could be seized by force. That lesson would not easily be forgotten. For the young Caesar, this atmosphere presented both caution and opportunity. He was in his early 20s, ambitious, but still without major office. The path ahead followed the established sequence of magistracies, each step requiring careful navigation through Rome's complex political networks. He began, as many aspiring statesmen did, through legal advocacy. Roman courts were not merely arenas for justice. They were stages upon which reputation could be built. A skilled advocate who spoke persuasively against corruption or mismanagement could gain public attention and cultivate alliances. Caesar demonstrated early talent in oratory. Ancient writers describe him as deliberate and composed, preferring clarity over ornamentation. His style, even in youth, appears to have been measured rather than flamboyant. He understood that persuasion in Rome required not only passion, but credibility. One of his early notable cases involved prosecuting former governors accused of corruption in the provinces. By challenging abuses of power, Caesar positioned himself as a defender of fairness and order, a stance that resonated with popular sentiment. Yet these legal pursuits were only the first steps. In 69 BCE, Caesar was elected quaestor, the entry-level magistracy in the cursus honorum. As quaestor, he was assigned to serve in Hispania, or modern Spain. The role primarily involved financial administration, but it offered exposure to provincial governance and military command structures. During this period, a story is told that Caesar, while in Spain, stood before a statue of Alexander the Great and reflected on his own accomplishments. Alexander, by his early 30s, had conquered vast territories. Caesar, approaching a similar age, had not yet achieved comparable glory. Whether this moment occurred exactly as later described is uncertain, but the anecdote captures something essential. Caesar measured himself against greatness. He did not seek modest distinction. He sought transformation. Upon completing his quaestorship, Caesar returned to Rome and continued his ascent. In 65 BCE, he was elected aedile, a position responsible for organizing public games and maintaining certain civic structures. The office of aedile offered a unique opportunity, visibility. Public games were not minor entertainments. They were grand spectacles, chariot races, theatrical performances, gladiatorial contests, designed to delight the populace and display the generosity of their sponsors. Caesar embraced the opportunity fully. He financed elaborate games that surpassed expectations. Decorations adorned the city. Historical themes were revived. Even statues of Marius, previously suppressed under Sulla's regime, reappeared discreetly in public spaces. These gestures were subtle but meaningful. They signaled an alignment with popular memory and reformist sympathies without overtly challenging the Senate. However, such grandeur came at great personal expense. Caesar borrowed heavily to fund these spectacles. His debts grew substantial. Some contemporaries viewed his financial recklessness as dangerous. Others recognized it as strategic investment. In Rome, reputation often preceded authority. By captivating the public imagination, Caesar was building a foundation of support that would later prove invaluable. In 63 BCE, he sought election as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome's state religion. It was a bold move. The position carried immense prestige and lifelong tenure. It also placed its holder at the center of religious and political life. Caesar's rivals were older and more established. The campaign was intense. Ancient sources suggest that Caesar's financial commitments during this election were so significant that failure would have left him deeply vulnerable. On the morning of the vote, he is said to have told his mother that he would return home either as Pontifex Maximus or not at all. When the votes were counted, Caesar had won. The victory secured his residence in the official house of the Pontifex and elevated his standing dramatically. It demonstrated that he could defeat more senior figures in open contest. At the same time, events in Rome were unfolding that revealed the Republic's fragility. In that same year, 63 BCE, a conspiracy led by Lucius Sergius Catilina, known as Catiline, sought to overthrow parts of the government. Economic distress and political frustration had fueled the plot. When the conspiracy was uncovered, the Senate debated how to respond. Caesar, now a rising figure, argued for measured handling of the accused conspirators. He opposed immediate execution without trial, favoring imprisonment instead. His stance emphasized legal process and restraint. Ultimately, the Senate executed the conspirators. Caesar's position, though not prevailing, displayed his preference for institutional procedure over swift retribution. His public image was becoming clearer. ambitious, aligned with popular concerns, yet careful in presentation. By his late 30s, Julius Caesar had established himself as a formidable presence in Roman politics. He had navigated financial risk, electoral competition, and public controversy. But his ambitions extended further. The consulship, the highest annual office in the Republic, awaited those who could command sufficient support. To reach it would require alliances of a different scale, and Rome, restless and divided, was ready for new configurations of power. The shadow of Sulla still lingered over the Republic, but a new chapter was approaching, one that would reshape the balance of authority in ways few could yet fully imagine. By the early 60s BCE, Julius Caesar stood at a turning point in his political life. He had won public favor through generosity and spectacle. He had secured the prestigious position of Pontifex Maximus. He had demonstrated skill in the courts and composure in debate. Yet despite these accomplishments, the highest office in the Republic, the consulship, remained just beyond his grasp. Rome, meanwhile, continued its steady hum of ambition and rivalry. Two figures dominated the political landscape in these years: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history as Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Pompey had earned extraordinary prestige through military success. He had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, campaigned in the East, and expanded Roman influence across vast territories. His victories brought him immense popularity among the people and deep loyalty from his soldiers. Yet, despite his accomplishments, Pompey faced resistance within the Senate. Many aristocrats viewed his growing influence with quiet suspicion. They delayed ratification of his eastern settlements and land grants for his veterans, hoping to limit his power. Crassus, on the other hand, was known less for military triumph and more for immense wealth. He was said to be among the richest men in Rome. His financial influence allowed him to support political allies and shape public affairs behind the scenes. Crassus had also achieved military distinction, most notably in suppressing the slave revolt led by Spartacus. Yet he felt that Pompey often overshadowed him in reputation. Pompey and Crassus were rivals, and Caesar saw opportunity in that rivalry. In 60 BCE, Caesar returned from his governorship in Spain, where he had achieved modest military success and gained further experience. He sought election as consul for the coming year, but opposition from conservative senators threatened his prospects. The Republic's system required negotiation. No ambitious man could rise alone. Caesar recognized that if Pompey and Crassus could be brought into cooperation, however uneasy, their combined influence would outweigh senatorial resistance. And so, quietly and deliberately, Caesar facilitated an agreement between the two men. This informal political alliance, later called the First Triumvirate, was not an official institution. It was not recorded in law. It was a private understanding between three powerful individuals. Each would support the other's interests. Pompey would secure land for his veterans and approval of his eastern arrangements. Crassus would obtain financial advantages for his allies, particularly tax collectors in the provinces. Caesar would gain the consulship, and, crucially, a significant provincial command afterward. The alliance was practical rather than ideological. It rested on mutual benefit. In 59 BCE, Caesar was elected consul. His term proved contentious. Opposition from conservative senators, particularly Marcus Porcius Cato and others aligned with the Optimates, was persistent. They sought to block or delay legislation that favored Pompey's settlements and Crassus's interests. Caesar responded with resolve. He presented laws directly to the popular assemblies when the Senate resisted. He ensured that land redistribution for Pompey's veterans moved forward. He advanced measures beneficial to his allies. His co-consul, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, opposed him frequently. Ancient sources suggest that Bibulus eventually withdrew from public business for much of the year, claiming unfavorable religious omens to obstruct Caesar's legislation. Caesar continued regardless. It was said, somewhat humorously, that Romans referred to that year not as the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but simply as the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Whether exaggerated or not, the phrase reflects how dominant Caesar's presence had become. At the end of his consulship, Caesar secured what may have been the most significant element of the Triumvirate agreement, a 5-year governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and later Transalpine Gaul. This command granted him authority over multiple legions, and with legions came opportunity. Provincial governorships often provided wealth and prestige, but Gaul offered something more. It offered war. Beyond the northern borders of Roman territory lay a patchwork of Celtic tribes. Some had long-standing relations with Rome, others resisted Roman expansion. Movements of migrating tribes created instability. Caesar would soon position himself as Rome's defender, and, in doing so, expand both Roman territory and his own renown. Meanwhile, the Triumvirate required maintenance. To strengthen ties with Pompey, Caesar arranged a marriage between Pompey and his daughter Julia. The union was not merely political. Ancient accounts suggest that Pompey and Julia developed genuine affection for one another. For a time, the alliance functioned smoothly. Pompey remained in Rome, overseeing affairs and benefiting from Caesar's legislative successes. Crassus continued his financial enterprises. Caesar prepared to depart for Gaul. The Republic, outwardly intact, now rested upon a delicate understanding between 3 men. It was not the first time Rome had depended upon powerful individuals, but this arrangement carried a different quality. The balance of the Republic had shifted subtly. Power was no longer distributed solely through institutions. It was concentrated in relationships. And Caesar, stepping beyond Rome's northern frontier with his legions, was about to begin the chapter that would transform him from ambitious politician into legendary commander. The quiet fields and forests of Gaul awaited, and with them, the next turning of history. In the spring of 58 BCE, Julius Caesar departed Rome and traveled north toward his assigned provinces. Behind him, the city continued its steady rhythm of debate and ceremony. Before him stretched lands that to many Romans felt distant and uncertain, forests thick with mist, rivers broad and cold, and tribal territories only loosely connected to Roman authority. Caesar's proconsular command granted him control over Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and later Transalpine Gaul. More importantly, it placed several legions under his leadership. For an ambitious Roman statesman, such a command was invaluable. Military success brought honor. Honor brought influence. Influence, in Rome, could shape the future of the Republic itself. Yet Caesar did not initially march north in search of conquest alone. Events along Rome's frontier soon provided justification for action. A large migratory movement was underway among the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe inhabiting what is now Switzerland. Pressured by neighboring groups and seeking more fertile land, they planned to move westward across Gaul. Their route would pass near Roman territory. Caesar framed the migration as a potential threat to Roman allies and to the security of the province. Acting swiftly, he fortified key crossing points along the Rhone River and denied the Helvetii passage through Roman lands. When negotiations failed, conflict followed. The campaign against the Helvetii marked the beginning of what would become the Gallic Wars. The fighting, though significant, was presented by Caesar in measured and strategic terms in his later writings. He described the Helvetii as disciplined and numerous, emphasizing the scale of the challenge while portraying Roman forces as orderly and resolute. After a series of engagements, the Helvetii were defeated and compelled to return to their homeland. The outcome secured Caesar's standing among his legions. It also demonstrated something essential. He was not merely a politician in military dress. He was a capable commander. In Rome, news of victory traveled steadily southward. Each dispatch enhanced his reputation. But Gaul was vast. The defeat of the Helvetii did not bring immediate peace. Tribal alliances shifted constantly. Some leaders sought Roman protection, others resisted Roman influence. Caesar adopted a strategy that combined military strength with diplomatic calculation. He intervened in disputes between tribes, presenting himself as arbiter and protector. When alliances formed against him, he responded decisively. In 57 BCE, a coalition of northern tribes known collectively as the Belgae posed a new challenge. Caesar's legions marched across rivers and through wooded terrain to confront them. The campaigns required endurance. Gaul was not Italy. Its climate was harsher. Its settlements were dispersed, supply lines stretched across unfamiliar ground. Yet Roman military organization proved adaptable. Legions constructed fortified camps at the end of each day's march. Roads were cleared. Bridges were engineered across wide rivers. Discipline remained firm. Caesar paid careful attention to morale. He addressed his soldiers directly before engagements, reminding them of previous victories and emphasizing the order and cohesion that distinguished Roman forces. His presence in the field, visible, composed, reinforced confidence. Over successive campaigns, Roman authority expanded. Some tribes submitted willingly, calculating that alliance with Rome offered stability. Others resisted and were subdued. Throughout these years, Caesar documented events in what would later become known as the Commentari de Bello Gallico, his commentaries on the Gallic War. These writings served multiple purposes. They informed Rome of developments. They shaped public perception. They presented Caesar not as aggressor, but as defender and stabilizer. The prose was direct and unadorned. It emphasized logistics, numbers, and strategic reasoning. By narrating his own campaigns in third person, Caesar created an image of objective authority. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the triumvirate endured, though not without strain. Pompey remained influential but increasingly isolated from military glory. Crassus sought opportunities to enhance his own reputation abroad. In 56 BCE, the three men met in the city of Lucca to renew their alliance. Agreements were made to extend Caesar's command and secure future consulships for Pompey and Crassus. The arrangement held for the moment. In Gaul, however, resistance had not vanished. The land was diverse. From the Atlantic coast to the Rhine River, tribes maintained distinct identities and traditions. Some regions required repeated campaigns to secure compliance. In 55 BCE, Caesar undertook a bold demonstration. Germanic tribes had crossed the Rhine River into Gaul. Rather than merely defend Roman territory, Caesar constructed a massive wooden bridge across the Rhine itself, an engineering feat accomplished in remarkably short time. He led his legions across, conducted a brief campaign to assert Roman strength, and then withdrew. The message was clear. Rome could reach beyond natural boundaries. Not long afterward, Caesar turned his attention across another expanse of water. He launched expeditions to Britannia, the island beyond Gaul that lay at the edge of Roman geographic knowledge. These expeditions were limited in scope, more reconnaissance than conquest, yet they expanded Rome's awareness and enhanced Caesar's prestige. Each campaign added to his renown. His soldiers grew experienced and loyal. Many had now served under him for years. They trusted his leadership and benefited from shared success. With every passing season, Caesar's position strengthened. The Republic still stood, the Senate still debated. But in the forests and fields of Gaul, far from Rome's marble halls, a new concentration of power was taking shape, forged not in speeches alone, but in shared campaigns, discipline, and ambition. The rise of Julius Caesar was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding, step by measured step, beneath the northern skies. As the years in Gaul unfolded, Julius Caesar's campaigns grew in both scale and complexity. What had begun as a defensive intervention along Rome's frontier gradually became a sustained effort to secure and ultimately dominate the vast territories north of Italy. The forests, rivers, and rolling plains of Gaul formed a landscape unlike the ordered fields of central Italy. It was a region of scattered settlements, fortified hilltop towns, and shifting alliances. For Rome, Gaul represented both opportunity and uncertainty. For Caesar, it represented transformation. By 54 BCE, several tribes had submitted to Roman authority, though submission often meant cautious compliance, rather than wholehearted loyalty. Tribal leaders were pragmatic. They observed Roman discipline, engineering skill, and battlefield organization. Many chose accommodation over prolonged conflict. Yet beneath the surface, resentment lingered. Roman presence meant tribute, hostages, and the erosion of autonomy. For proud tribal societies, these concessions were difficult. The winter of 54 BCE brought renewed unrest. Harsh weather strained supply lines. Roman legions were stationed in dispersed winter camps across Gaul. Sensing vulnerability, certain tribes coordinated attacks. One such uprising resulted in the destruction of a Roman detachment under the command of Sabinus and Cotta. The loss was serious, a reminder that Roman control was not absolute. Caesar responded with measured determination. He gathered his forces, moved swiftly through difficult terrain, and suppressed revolts with calculated force. His ability to maneuver legions rapidly across wide distances reinforced both fear and respect. Yet the cycle of resistance and response continued. In 53 BCE, Caesar launched another campaign across the Rhine, reinforcing Rome's capacity to project power beyond immediate borders. Once again, the crossing was symbolic as much as strategic. But it was in 52 BCE that the most significant challenge emerged. A young Arvernian noble named Vercingetorix began to unite disparate Gallic tribes under a common cause. Unification among the Gauls had always been difficult. Tribal identities were strong, rivalries were long-standing, yet Vercingetorix recognized that Rome's strength lay in discipline and unity, and that Gaul's only hope lay in matching that cohesion. He adopted a strategy of scorched earth. Villages and supplies were destroyed to deny Roman armies resources. Guerrilla tactics harassed Roman movements. Rather than engage in open battle, Vercingetorix sought to exhaust his opponent. It was a subtle and intelligent approach. Caesar, however, adapted. He maintained supply lines through engineering ingenuity and logistical planning. Roman camps were fortified meticulously. Intelligence networks gathered information on tribal movements. The conflict culminated in the siege of Alesia. Vercingetorix had fortified himself within a strong hilltop settlement, confident that relief forces would eventually surround Caesar's army. The position was formidable. High ground offered defensive advantage. The town's fortifications were substantial. Caesar made a decision that would define the campaign. Rather than retreat, he constructed an enormous system of fortifications around Alesia, a double line of walls and trenches encircling the settlement. One line faced inward to contain Vercingetorix and his forces. The other faced outward to defend against approaching relief armies. The engineering effort was immense. Miles of ramparts were raised. Ditches were dug. Obstacles were embedded into the earth to hinder enemy advance. Towers were positioned at regular intervals. As weeks passed, the situation grew tense. Inside Alesia, supplies dwindled. Outside, Gallic relief forces gathered in significant numbers. At last, the expected confrontation came. Relief forces attacked from without while Vercingetorix's men pressed from within. The Roman legions, caught between two armies, endured one of the most precarious moments of the entire war. Caesar moved calmly along the lines, reinforcing threatened positions. Reserves were deployed strategically. Cavalry counterattacks disrupted enemy formations. The discipline of the legions held. After prolonged struggle, the Gallic forces were repelled. Relief armies withdrew. Within Alesia, hope diminished. Vercingetorix ultimately surrendered. According to later accounts, he rode out of the gates, laid down his arms at Caesar's feet, and accepted captivity. The image is powerful, whether fully accurate or shaped by narrative tradition. With the fall of Alesia, organized resistance in Gaul effectively ended. Rome's authority was secured. For Caesar, the victory marked a turning point. He had subdued a vast region. He commanded experienced legions deeply loyal to him. His military accomplishments rivaled those of Pompey's earlier campaigns. News of Alesia traveled to Rome. Public admiration grew, yet with admiration came unease. The Senate could not ignore that Caesar's command had been extended beyond initial expectations. His popularity with the people remained strong. His legions were battle-hardened and devoted. Meanwhile, events within the Triumvirate altered the balance of power. In 54 BCE, Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. Her death severed the familial bond that had reinforced the alliance between Caesar and Pompey. In 53 BCE, Crassus embarked on a campaign against Parthia in the east, seeking military glory to rival his partners. The expedition ended disastrously at the Battle of Carrhae, where Crassus was defeated and killed. The Triumvirate, once a threefold balance, was reduced to two. And between Caesar and Pompey, distance grew. As Gaul settled under Roman rule, Caesar's rise had reached remarkable heights. But beyond the forests and rivers, back in the marble heart of Rome, tensions were quietly gathering. The Republic, steady yet fragile, was approaching another threshold. With the surrender at Alesia, the long struggle in Gaul began to settle into uneasy quiet. Roman garrisons were established. Roads were surveyed and extended. Tribute was organized. What had once been a patchwork of independent tribes now stood, in varying degrees, beneath Roman authority. For Julius Caesar, the years of campaigning had transformed him. He was no longer merely a rising politician. He was a commander of proven ability, a leader of legions who had marched beside him through forests, across rivers, and into sieges of daunting scale. His soldiers knew his voice. They trusted his judgment. Many had grown wealthy from spoils and land grants. Their loyalty was personal as well as institutional. Yet, while Caesar secured Gaul, Rome itself had not remained still. The delicate balance of the First Triumvirate had weakened. Julia's death in 54 BCE had quietly altered the emotional and political ties between Caesar and Pompey. Her marriage had once bridged ambition with affection, smoothing tensions that might otherwise have sharpened. Without her presence, the alliance rested solely on calculation. Then, in 53 BCE, the death of Crassus in Parthia removed the third pillar entirely. What had been a triangle of mutual restraint became a line of potential rivalry. Pompey remained in Rome, increasingly aligned with the conservative senatorial faction. He was granted special powers to stabilize unrest in the city, which had seen episodes of political violence and electoral disorder. His authority grew, but it grew within Rome, not on distant battlefields. Caesar, meanwhile, remained in Gaul, his command extended by agreement. But extension has limits. Under Roman law, a proconsul's authority ended when he re-entered Italy without formal renewal. Upon return, he would become a private citizen once more, subject to legal challenges and political prosecution. Many senators feared Caesar's growing influence. They viewed his military success and popularity with suspicion. Some sought to require him to relinquish his command before standing for another consulship. Caesar understood the implications. If he returned to Rome without office, he would lose the legal immunity that accompanied his command. His political enemies might pursue charges against him for alleged irregularities during his consulship or his Gallic campaigns. To step down without protection would be to step into vulnerability. Pompey's position was complex. Though once allied with Caesar, he now faced pressure from senatorial leaders who urged caution regarding Caesar's ambitions. Pompey had his own reputation to protect, his own legacy to consider. The Senate, in its debates, wrestled with the question of balance. Should Caesar be allowed to stand for consul in absentia, maintaining his command until elected? Or should he be required to disband his legions and return as a private citizen? These were not merely procedural matters. They touched the core of Roman constitutional practice. Tradition dictated that generals relinquish command before entering Rome. To do otherwise would risk blurring the line between military power and civic authority, a line that earlier generations had guarded carefully. Yet precedent had already shifted in subtle ways. The Republic had adapted before. The question was whether it could adapt again without fracturing. Through correspondence and envoys, Caesar signaled willingness to compromise. He proposed that both he and Pompey simultaneously relinquish their commands, restoring parity. The proposal carried logic, but trust was thin. In 50 BCE, tensions sharpened. The Senate, influenced by Caesar's opponents, passed resolutions urging him to disband his legions. Pompey was granted authority to raise troops in defense of the Republic. Each step, taken individually, appeared procedural. Taken together, they formed a narrowing path. Caesar's legions were stationed in Cisalpine Gaul, near the boundary of Italy proper. The Rubicon River marked that boundary, a small, unassuming stream whose crossing carried immense symbolic weight. Roman law forbade a general from bringing his army across it into Italy. To do so would be to march against the state. As winter settled in early 49 BCE, negotiations faltered. The Senate declared that Caesar must relinquish command or be considered an enemy of the Republic. Pompey began preparations for potential conflict. Caesar faced a decision that would define his place in history. He could submit, disband his legions, return to Rome, and trust in political processes that had grown increasingly hostile. Or he could assert his position by force. It is said that in January of 49 BCE, standing near the banks of the Rubicon with a single legion, Caesar paused. The moment was quiet. The river itself was modest, hardly imposing, yet its legal and symbolic boundary separated two futures. Ancient sources record that he spoke a brief phrase, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. Whether those exact words were spoken at that exact moment remains uncertain. What is certain is that Caesar led his legion across. The crossing was not a dramatic charge. It was deliberate, measured, irreversible. News spread quickly. Pompey and many senators withdrew from Rome, heading south to gather forces. The city itself, unprepared for immediate confrontation, opened its gates without resistance. Caesar entered Rome not as a conqueror amid flames, but as a commander, asserting legitimacy. He framed his actions not as rebellion, but as defense against injustice. The Republic had crossed its own boundary. The balance that had sustained it for centuries now shifted into open civil war. The forests of Gaul had witnessed Caesar's rise. The quiet waters of the Rubicon marked the beginning of something far greater. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in the early days of 49 BCE, the act itself was swift. The consequences unfolded more slowly. Rome, accustomed to political rivalry, now faced open conflict between two of its most powerful men. Yet in those first days, there was little immediate violence within the city itself. Pompey and many leading senators had already withdrawn southward, choosing not to defend Rome directly. They calculated that time and preparation would favor them. Pompey possessed advantages. He commanded loyalty among much of the Senate. He had influence across the eastern provinces. He could draw upon vast resources and established networks of allies. His past victories had earned him prestige throughout the Mediterranean. Caesar, by contrast, held seasoned legions, hardened by years of campaigning in Gaul, but fewer in number at the outset of the civil war. Speed would be his ally. Rather than pause in Rome, Caesar moved methodically through Italy, securing towns and ports. Many communities offered little resistance. Some welcomed him. Others simply preferred stability to uncertainty. Pompey and the senatorial leadership gathered their forces in the south before departing for Greece. There, across the Adriatic Sea, they intended to assemble a larger army drawn from eastern provinces. The civil war, though born in Italy, would expand far beyond it. Caesar understood that hesitation would allow his opponents to consolidate strength. In a display of calculated boldness, he turned first toward Spain, where Pompey's legates commanded substantial forces. "I go to fight an army without a general," Caesar is later reported to have said, "so that I may then fight a general without an army." The phrase, whether exact or polished by history, captures his strategic thinking. In Spain, Caesar maneuvered skillfully, avoiding unnecessary bloodshed where possible. Through sieges and careful positioning, he compelled Pompeian forces to surrender. His reputation for clemency, offering pardon to defeated opponents, began to distinguish him from earlier figures like Sulla. Clemency was not weakness, it was policy. By pardoning captured senators and officers, Caesar sought to reduce long-term hostility and present himself as restorer rather than destroyer of the Republic. Meanwhile, Pompey gathered strength in Greece. His navy controlled much of the Adriatic, making Caesar's crossing difficult. In early 48 BCE, Caesar undertook the risky voyage across winter seas with limited forces. Storms scattered ships, supplies were uncertain. Yet he established a foothold on Greek soil. For a time, both armies maneuvered without decisive engagement. They constructed fortified camps, monitored one another's movements, and tested positions cautiously. The tension was profound. These were not foreign adversaries. They were Romans facing Romans. Each side included senators, magistrates, veterans, and allies who had once stood together in public ceremonies. At Dyrrhachium, Pompey achieved a tactical advantage. Caesar's forces suffered shortages and setbacks. It was a reminder that civil war does not guarantee swift triumph. Yet Caesar remained composed. He withdrew in orderly fashion and moved inland toward Thessaly. Pompey followed, encouraged by senators who urged decisive battle. The confrontation came near the town of Pharsalus in August of 48 BCE. The plains stretched wide beneath a summer sky. Dust rose beneath the movement of troops. Standards lifted above disciplined ranks. Pompey's army outnumbered Caesar's. Many senators present believed victory assured, but numbers alone do not determine outcome. Caesar arranged his legions with careful attention to terrain and reserve strength. Anticipating Pompey's reliance on superior cavalry, he positioned additional cohorts to counter flanking maneuvers. When battle began, it unfolded with intensity, but also order. Lines advanced. Missiles were thrown. Infantry pressed forward in measured formation. Pompey's cavalry initially pushed Caesar's flank, yet Caesar's hidden reserves counterattacked, disrupting momentum. Gradually the balance shifted. Pompey's forces faltered. Confusion spread. Retreat began. The defeat was decisive. Pompey fled the field, eventually seeking refuge in Egypt. Caesar did not pursue in anger. He followed deliberately, aware that civil conflict could not end while Pompey remained a symbol of resistance. When Pompey arrived in Egypt, he encountered a court divided by its own internal struggles. Seeking favor with Caesar, Egyptian officials made a fateful decision. They ordered Pompey's assassination. When Caesar arrived shortly thereafter and was presented with Pompey's severed head, ancient sources suggest that he reacted not with satisfaction, but with visible sorrow. Pompey had once been his ally. He had been a leading figure of Rome. Civil war had ended one rivalry, but at profound cost. Yet the war itself was not entirely finished. Resistance continued in parts of Africa and Spain. Still, the central contest between Caesar and Pompey had concluded. Caesar now stood as the dominant military force of the Roman world. But dominance brings new questions. How would he govern? Would he restore the republic in form and substance, or would his authority reshape it permanently? The quiet fields of Pharsalus had answered one question. Many others remained. After the dust had settled at Pharsalus, and the once great army of Pompey had scattered across the plains of Thessaly, the civil war seemed for a moment suspended in quiet uncertainty. Pompey himself had fled. His path led southward across the Mediterranean toward Egypt, a kingdom ancient even by Roman standards. Egypt was wealthy, fertile, and politically complex. Its rulers descended from the line of Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. Though independent in name, Egypt existed in delicate partnership with Rome, its stability deeply intertwined with Roman interests. Pompey believed he would find refuge there, but the Egypt he arrived in was not stable. The young king, Ptolemy XIII, shared power uneasily with his sister, Cleopatra VII. Their rivalry had already fractured the royal court. Advisors maneuvered behind palace walls. Armies loyal to different factions guarded strategic positions. When Pompey landed on Egyptian shores in 48 BCE, he sought alliance. Instead, he encountered calculation. Advisors to Ptolemy reasoned that Caesar, now victorious at Pharsalus, would soon follow. To gain favor with the emerging power in Rome, they made a grim decision. Pompey was killed shortly after arriving. His head was taken as a token. When Caesar reached Alexandria not long afterward, he expected to confront a rival. Instead, he was presented with proof that the rivalry had ended without his command. Ancient accounts describe Caesar's reaction as subdued, even sorrowful. Pompey had been his son-in-law. He had once been partner in shaping Rome's political direction. Civil war had divided them, but their shared history remained. The sight of his former ally's fate may have underscored the cost of Rome's internal conflict, yet events in Egypt did not allow Caesar to linger long in reflection. The dispute between Ptolemy and Cleopatra demanded attention. Both sought Caesar's recognition and support. Egypt's grain shipments were vital to Rome. Stability along the Nile was not a distant matter. It touched the daily sustenance of the capital. Cleopatra, known for intelligence and political skill, maneuvered boldly. Later stories recount her dramatic arrival before Caesar, concealed within a carpet or bedding to evade her brother's guards. Whether the scene unfolded exactly as described, it reflects her determination to secure audience. Caesar found himself drawn into Egypt's dynastic struggle. At first, his involvement may have been framed as arbitration. Yet circumstances soon escalated. Tensions between the factions erupted into conflict within Alexandria itself. Caesar, with limited forces, found his position precarious. The harbor became contested. Fires broke out, possibly damaging parts of the great library of Alexandria, though the extent remains debated among historians. For months, Caesar's small contingent endured siege-like conditions within the city. Reinforcements eventually arrived. In 47 BCE, Caesar's forces defeated those loyal to Ptolemy XIII. The young king drowned while attempting to flee across the Nile. Cleopatra emerged as ruler, though formally she shared the throne with another younger brother in accordance with tradition. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra extended beyond political alliance. Ancient sources describe personal closeness between them, though the exact nature and depth remain subjects of interpretation. A child, Ptolemy XV Caesarion, was later born to Cleopatra. She claimed Caesar as the father. Whether Caesar fully acknowledged this claim is less certain, but the association added another layer to his already complex public image. While in Egypt, Caesar did not remain idle. He traveled briefly along the Nile, observing the ancient civilization whose monuments predated Rome itself by centuries. Yet Rome's affairs required attention. Resistance persisted in other regions. In Asia Minor, Caesar quickly defeated forces aligned against him at the Battle of Zela. His message to Rome afterward was famously concise: Veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. The phrase captured efficiency rather than triumphal excess. Still, challenges remained in North Africa and Spain, where Pompeian supporters regrouped. Civil war does not dissolve instantly, but momentum favored Caesar. His campaigns in Africa culminated in victory at Thapsus in 46 BCE. Later, in 45 BCE, he defeated remaining opposition at Munda in Spain. Each victory further consolidated his authority. When Caesar returned to Rome, he did so not merely as a general who had won a civil war, but as the uncontested leader of the Roman world. The Republic's institutions still existed. Consuls were elected, the Senate convened, but the balance had shifted. Caesar held unprecedented power. Egypt, with its ancient rhythms and quiet riverbanks, had witnessed a turning in Rome's story. Pompey was gone. The Triumvirate was dissolved. The Civil War's central chapter had closed. Now Rome awaited the next phase, not of battle, but of governance. And the question lingered softly in the air. What form would Rome take under Caesar's dominance? When Julius Caesar returned to Rome after years of campaigning, he entered a city both familiar and altered. The marble temples still stood. The Forum still echoed with voices of debate. Processions still wound through the streets beneath the Mediterranean sun. Yet beneath these outward signs of continuity, Rome had changed. Civil war leaves quiet traces. Families had been divided. Alliances had fractured. Some senators had fallen in battle. Others had been pardoned and restored to position. The Republic had survived, but not untouched. Caesar did not return as a temporary magistrate completing his term. He returned as the dominant figure in Roman public life. In 46 BCE, he celebrated a series of triumphs, elaborate processions marking victories in Gaul, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Africa. Such celebrations were traditional honors granted to successful generals, but never before had triumphs of such scale and variety been awarded to a single individual in such close succession. Exotic animals were displayed, captives marched in chains, wealth from distant lands adorned the procession. Among those paraded was Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader, who had once united tribes against Rome. The spectacle was grand, yet measured. Caesar was careful in his presentation. He emphasized not conquest for its own sake, but restoration of order. He promoted an image of clemency. Many former enemies had been pardoned. Senators who had once stood against him were permitted to return to Rome. Some were even granted positions within his administration. Clemency was not only moral posture, it was political strategy. By reducing the number of embittered opponents, Caesar sought to stabilize the state. He was appointed dictator, first for a limited term, then extended, and eventually in 44 BCE as dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. The title carried weight. In earlier centuries, a dictator had been appointed only in times of emergency and only for 6 months. The role was meant to provide decisive authority during crisis. Caesar's perpetual dictatorship represented something new. Yet, despite the concentration of power, Caesar did not dismantle the Republic's institutions outright. The Senate continued to meet. Magistrates were still elected. The forms of governance remained, but substance and form do not always align perfectly. Caesar embarked on a series of reforms aimed at strengthening and reorganizing Rome. He addressed debt relief, though cautiously, seeking balance between creditors and debtors. He reorganized provincial administration to reduce corruption. He expanded the Senate, adding members from Italy and the provinces, a move that broadened representation but diluted the influence of old aristocratic families. He initiated public works projects. The Roman calendar, long misaligned with the solar year due to irregular adjustments, was reformed under his authority. With the assistance of Egyptian astronomers, he introduced what became known as the Julian calendar, a system more precise and enduring than its predecessor. It is a quiet but profound legacy. Even centuries later, the structure of time itself would still echo Caesar's reform. He also planned vast infrastructure projects, draining marshes, constructing new forums, and reorganizing the grain supply. There was a sense of movement, of Rome stepping into a new phase. Yet not all welcomed these changes. Some senators grew uneasy at the accumulation of honors. Statues were erected in his likeness. His image appeared on coinage, a striking departure from tradition, as living Romans had not typically been depicted so prominently. He was granted the right to wear distinctive attire and sit upon a gilded chair during public ceremonies. Each honor, taken alone, might have seemed ceremonial. Taken together, they suggested transformation. Whispers began to circulate. Was Caesar aspiring to kingship? The word king, rex, carried deep historical weight in Rome. Centuries earlier, the Romans had expelled their last king and established the Republic precisely to prevent one man from holding supreme authority. Even the suggestion of monarchy stirred discomfort. Caesar publicly rejected the title when it was symbolically offered during a festival. Whether the gesture was spontaneous or staged remains uncertain. But the moment revealed tension. He accepted extraordinary powers, yet denied the name of king. For many citizens, daily life continued steadily. Markets opened, courts convened, grain shipments arrived. For others, particularly among the old aristocracy, the direction of change felt unsettling. Rome had been governed by shared offices and rotating authority for generations. Now, one man's presence dominated. Caesar may have envisioned reform and renewal, but perception shapes reality. The Republic, though outwardly functioning, was evolving into something different. The rise of Julius Caesar had reached its summit, and as history often reveals, summits are quiet places where winds shift gently and the air carries both triumph and tension. As the months passed, following Julius Caesar's return to Rome, his authority settled into something that felt both stable and unfamiliar. The outward machinery of the Republic continued to turn. Consuls were elected, senators debated proposals, magistrates administered law, public festivals followed their ancient rhythms, and yet, at the center of it all, stood one figure whose influence extended further than any Roman before him. Caesar did not move recklessly. He understood that Rome valued continuity, even in times of change. His reforms were introduced gradually, framed as restoration rather than revolution. One of his most practical and enduring changes was the reorganization of the calendar. For generations, Rome's calendar had drifted from the solar year. Political manipulation of intercalary months had created confusion. Festivals no longer aligned consistently with seasons. Agricultural cycles were disrupted by administrative inconsistency. With guidance from scholars familiar with Egyptian astronomy, Caesar implemented a solar-based calendar in 45 BCE. The new system divided the year into 365 days, with an additional day added every fourth year. It was orderly, predictable. In subtle ways, it symbolized Caesar's broader approach, imposing structure upon disorder. He also addressed provincial governance. Corruption among governors had long troubled Rome's relationship with its territories. Caesar introduced measures to regulate tax collection and limit exploitation. Provincial communities were granted more stable administration and, in some cases, extended citizenship rights. Citizenship, once confined tightly within Italy, began to expand outward. This expansion was both practical and symbolic. It bound distant communities more closely to Rome, while reshaping the definition of what it meant to be Roman. Within the city itself, Caesar undertook urban development. He initiated construction of a new forum to relieve congestion in the old one. Plans were drawn for the rebuilding of certain districts. He envisioned reorganizing public spaces to accommodate a growing population. These projects offered employment and projected confidence. Yet alongside practical reforms came honors that unsettled some observers. The Senate decreed that his statue be placed among those of Rome's ancient kings. A golden chair was reserved for him in public events. His image appeared on coins, a departure from long-standing custom. Symbolism matters deeply in political life. Rome's identity rested upon its rejection of monarchy. Even the faint echo of royal imagery stirred anxiety among traditionalists. Caesar's acceptance of perpetual dictatorship intensified concern. To many citizens, his authority brought stability after years of civil war. To others, it signaled the erosion of republican balance. Among the Senate, divisions sharpened. Some members supported Caesar sincerely, believing that strong centralized leadership was necessary to prevent further chaos. Others complied outwardly while harboring private doubt. A smaller group grew increasingly troubled. These men did not necessarily oppose reform itself. Many had accepted Caesar's clemency after Pharsalus. Some even held offices under his administration. But they feared the concentration of power. They feared that the Republic, though preserved in name, was dissolving in substance. Caesar's demeanor did little to ease all concerns. He often conducted Senate sessions, seated while others stood, a gesture interpreted by some as symbolic of superiority. Whether intentional or incidental, such moments accumulated in memory. He granted pardons generously, yet he also appointed loyalists to key positions. The expansion of the Senate diluted the influence of old aristocratic families, altering long-established hierarchies. For Caesar, these measures may have represented modernization. For his critics, they suggested transformation beyond recognition. In early 44 BCE, a new series of honors was proposed. He was granted the title Father of the Fatherland. His birthday was declared a public festival. A special oath was taken to defend his person. During the festival of Lupercalia, Mark Antony, a close ally of Caesar, publicly offered him a diadem, a symbol associated with kingship. Caesar refused. The crowd reacted with mixed applause. Whether the gesture was spontaneous or orchestrated remains debated by historians. Yet its symbolism was unmistakable. Even the suggestion of kingship stirred deep discomfort. Caesar understood Rome's aversion to monarchy. His refusal may have been genuine. It may also have been political theater. But in the quiet corridors of the Senate, suspicion grew. Some began to ask whether the Republic could survive indefinitely under one man's enduring command. Others feared that once Caesar departed, by age or accident, the concentration of power would leave a vacuum too dangerous to fill peacefully. And so, beneath the surface of public ceremony and reform, another current moved. It was subtle, measured, yet persistent. The rise of Julius Caesar had reshaped Rome. Now, in the quiet spaces between speeches and decrees, thoughts of resistance began to take form. By the early months of 44 BCE, Rome appeared calm on the surface. The markets continued to open at dawn. Senators gathered beneath marble porticos. Priests observed sacred rituals. The Tiber flowed steadily past its stone embankments. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, unease had begun to settle like a faint mist over certain corners of public life. Julius Caesar held more authority than any Roman before him. He had been named dictator perpetuo. His image appeared on coinage. His reforms were reshaping administration, citizenship, and even the measurement of time. To many citizens, these changes offered welcome stability after years of conflict. To others, particularly among the older aristocratic families, they signaled something quieter but more profound, the gradual fading of the Republic's shared governance. Opposition did not form immediately as a unified movement. It began as private conversations, a glance exchanged during a Senate session, a measured remark made in confidence, a memory recalled of ancestral struggles against monarchy. Rome's identity was deeply rooted in the expulsion of its last king centuries earlier. The story of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, driven from the city to establish the Republic, was not merely history. It was foundational myth, retold and revered. The very word king carried weight that could not be easily dismissed. Among those who grew increasingly troubled were men who had once benefited from Caesar's clemency. Marcus Junius Brutus was one of them. Brutus came from a distinguished lineage. His ancestor, also named Brutus, was traditionally credited with leading the revolt against Rome's last king. The symbolism of that heritage was powerful. Brutus had fought on the side of Pompey during the Civil War. After Pharsalus, Caesar had pardoned him and even elevated him to positions of responsibility. In many ways, Brutus owed his renewed political life to Caesar's mercy. Yet gratitude and conviction do not always move in harmony. Brutus was known for philosophical inclinations influenced by Stoic thought and ideals of civic virtue. The concentration of power in a single individual troubled him, not necessarily because of personal grievance, but because of principle. Another key figure was Gaius Cassius Longinus. Cassius, too, had supported Pompey and had been pardoned. He possessed a sharper temperament than Brutus, more openly skeptical of Caesar's growing authority. Cassius is often described in ancient sources as perceptive and restless. Whether entirely accurate or shaped by later narratives, he appears to have played a central role in encouraging organized resistance. Their concerns were not alone. A small but determined group of senators began to meet discreetly. These meetings were cautious. Rome was a city of informants and shifting loyalties. Open dissent against the dictator carried significant risk. The conspirators framed their intentions not as personal revenge, but as defense of the Republic. They believed that by removing Caesar they would restore traditional balance. It was a belief shaped by memory, by the conviction that Rome's strength lay in shared power rather than singular command. Yet they faced a dilemma. Caesar remained popular among many, or among citizens. The legions were loyal. His reforms had tangible benefits. He had shown clemency toward former enemies. An open political challenge might fail. Force, though dangerous, began to appear as the only remaining path. The decision was not made lightly. Ancient accounts suggest that debate continued over timing and method. Some proposed assassination during public games. Others feared collateral harm to bystanders. Ultimately, the conspirators settled upon a moment within the Senate itself. The setting would carry symbolism. If Caesar fell within the very institution that embodied Rome's political tradition, the act could be framed as restoration rather than rebellion. The chosen date was the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, when the Senate was scheduled to convene at the theater of Pompey. The location itself was layered with meaning. The theater of Pompey had been constructed by Caesar's former rival. To gather there was routine, to act there would carry quiet irony. As the date approached, outward life continued undisturbed. Caesar made preparations for campaigns beyond Rome. He contemplated a military expedition against Parthia, perhaps seeking to extend Rome's influence further east and avenge Crassus's earlier defeat. Plans were drafted, appointments were discussed, but in private homes and shaded courtyards, resolve hardened. The conspirators swore oaths. They agreed that each would strike, ensuring shared responsibility. The number involved remains debated, perhaps 60 or more. Brutus, reluctant yet committed, joined them. The irony was profound. Caesar had extended mercy. Now mercy would not be returned. In the days before the Ides, subtle signs were later remembered. Omens, dreams, warnings whispered. Such details often grow in memory after events unfold. They lend narrative shape to moments that, at the time, may have seemed ordinary. Yet what remains certain is this: Rome, quiet beneath its early, spring sky, stood on the edge of transformation once more. The rise of Julius Caesar had reached its highest point, and as history often reveals, it is at such heights that the air grows thin and decisions become irreversible. The morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, began like many others in Rome. The early light stretched gently across tiled rooftops. Vendors prepared their stalls. Citizens moved along familiar streets, wrapped in conversation and daily obligation. The air held the softness of early spring. Yet, within the city, unseen by most, a decision had already been set in motion. The Senate was scheduled to convene that day at the theater of Pompey, a grand complex of stone columns and open courtyards built years earlier by Caesar's former rival. It was a familiar meeting place when the traditional Senate house was unavailable. Julius Caesar prepared to attend. Ancient accounts describe subtle warnings in the days leading up to this morning. A soothsayer who had cautioned him to beware the Ides of March. Unusual dreams reported by his wife Calpurnia, small signs interpreted later as omens. Whether these warnings were emphasized more strongly in hindsight cannot be known with certainty. What is known is that Caesar hesitated briefly that morning. Calpurnia, according to some sources, urged him not to attend the session. She had dreamed of his statue flowing with blood, a symbolic image that unsettled her deeply. Caesar considered postponement, yet political life rarely pauses for apprehension. One of the conspirators, Decimus Brutus, reportedly reassured him that the Senate awaited his presence and that absence might be interpreted as weakness or insult. Caesar chose to go. He dressed as usual, calm and deliberate. As he walked through the city streets toward the theater of Pompey, citizens greeted him. Some sought petitions, others simply watched. Nothing in the public atmosphere suggested what would soon unfold. Inside the theater complex, the conspirators had already gathered. They moved with composure, careful not to attract suspicion. Each knew his role. Each carried concealed resolve. When Caesar entered the chamber, senators rose. He took his seat. The proceedings began as routine. Then, at a prearranged signal, the conspirators approached. One of them presented a petition, a common occurrence in Roman political life. As Caesar read or declined it, another moved closer. The first blow was struck quickly. Accounts differ on exact sequence, but what is clear is that multiple attackers joined in swift succession. Blades flashed briefly in the enclosed space. Caesar attempted to rise. He may have tried to defend himself, or perhaps to comprehend the suddenness of betrayal. Among the faces around him was Marcus Junius Brutus. Later tradition places words upon Caesar's lips, expressions of surprise or recognition. Whether spoken or imagined, such phrases capture the poignancy of that moment. Within moments, it was over. Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue. The symbolism was stark. The conqueror of Gaul, the victor of civil war, the reformer of Rome, struck down not on battlefield, but within the Senate chamber. The conspirators stepped back, their task completed. For a brief instant, there was silence, then confusion. Some senators fled in shock, others remained frozen. The conspirators proclaimed that the Republic had been restored. They declared themselves liberators. Yet outside the chamber, Rome remained unaware. Word spread gradually. At first, disbelief, then uncertainty, then fear. Citizens gathered in small clusters, asking questions without answers. Mark Antony, Caesar's close ally, had not been present at the moment of attack. He withdrew cautiously, uncertain of the conspirators' intentions. The city did not erupt immediately into violence. Instead, it entered a state of suspended tension. The conspirators had expected celebration, perhaps even gratitude. But reaction was more complex. Caesar had been popular among many citizens. He had distributed land, organized games, expanded opportunity. The memory of civil war was still fresh, and now, once again, Rome stood without clear direction. The body of Julius Caesar lay still within the theater complex. The rise that had carried him from the Subura to supreme authority had ended not with decree or retirement, but with coordinated blades. The Ides of March would echo through centuries. But in that immediate afternoon, Rome did not yet know what it had become. It only knew that something irreversible had occurred. In the hours following Julius Caesar's death, Rome did not erupt into immediate chaos. Instead, a strange stillness settled over the city. The Senate chamber had emptied quickly after the attack. Many who had not been part of the conspiracy fled in confusion, uncertain whether further violence would follow. Conspirators themselves remained briefly within the theater complex, lifting their blood-marked blades and proclaiming liberty. They believed they had struck a decisive blow for the Republic. Yet outside those walls, ordinary citizens moved through their day with only fragments of rumor. A whisper passed through the forum. A hurried messenger crossed a courtyard. A shopkeeper paused mid-conversation as news spread unevenly. Caesar has been killed. For some, the words seemed impossible. For others, they carried immediate weight. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies and serving consul at the time, reacted with caution. He had not been present during the attack. Warned of the danger, he withdrew briefly, unsure whether the conspirators intended broader purges. The conspirators, however, had not sought widespread bloodshed. They had targeted Caesar alone. Their vision, as they understood it, was surgical: remove the dictator, restore the republic. They gathered supporters and made their way to the Capitoline Hill, a place of symbolic significance in Roman life. From there, they sought to present themselves as defenders of liberty rather than aggressors. Yet Rome did not respond with unified acclaim. There were no spontaneous parades in their honor, no immediate embrace of restored republican governance. Instead, there was uncertainty. Caesar had been both powerful and popular. He had provided public works, celebrations, and stability after years of civil war. Many citizens had benefited from his rule. Veterans had received land. The urban poor had experienced order. To them, his death felt less like liberation and more like disruption. Over the next days, negotiations unfolded. Antony, cautious but composed, opened communication with the conspirators. Both sides recognized the danger of renewed civil war. Compromise, at least temporarily, appeared necessary. The Senate convened. It was agreed that Caesar's acts and reforms would remain valid. His appointments would stand. In exchange, the conspirators would not face immediate prosecution. This fragile settlement reflected Rome's desire to avoid another descent into open conflict. Yet beneath the surface, emotions stirred. Caesar's will was opened and read. In it, he named his great-nephew Gaius Octavius, a young man not yet widely known, as his adopted son and principal heir. Octavius would take the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. The will also included a remarkable gesture. Caesar left a sum of money to every Roman citizen. He bequeathed his gardens along the Tiber for public use. These provisions deepened public sympathy. The man some senators had feared as a tyrant had remembered the people in his final testament. Plans were made for Caesar's funeral. It would become a turning point. On the day of the ceremony, crowds gathered in the forum. The atmosphere was heavy with curiosity and emotion. Caesar's body lay displayed. His accomplishments were recounted. Then Mark Antony rose to speak. His funeral oration, preserved in various forms by later writers, has become one of the most remembered speeches in Roman history. Antony did not openly condemn the conspirators at first. He spoke of Caesar's victories, his generosity, his refusal of the diadem. He reminded the crowd of the dictator's gifts to the people. Gradually, the tone shifted. Emotion replaced neutrality. When Caesar's blood-stained garments were displayed, the crowd reacted visibly. Grief gave way to anger. The fragile balance collapsed. The funeral pyre, intended to be orderly, became spontaneous and intense. Citizens gathered wood and benches to fuel the flames. The crowd surged. The homes of some conspirators were threatened. Brutus and Cassius, recognizing the shift in public mood, withdrew from the city. The Republic, supposedly restored, stood once more on unstable ground. Caesar's death had not ended political dominance. It had unleashed uncertainty, and in the space left by his fall, new figures began to step forward. Among them was the young heir, named in his will, Octavian, who would soon arrive in Rome to claim his inheritance. The rise of Julius Caesar had ended, but his fall had not restored the old order. It had opened a new chapter. Rome once again stood at the edge of transformation. In the days following Caesar's funeral, Rome felt suspended between grief and uncertainty. Smoke from the funeral pyre had drifted upward into the spring sky, but the emotional residue lingered in the streets. Citizens spoke in lowered tones, veterans gathered in small circles, senators moved carefully, aware that alliances had shifted overnight. The conspirators had imagined themselves as restorers of the Republic, yet they had misjudged something essential. They had removed Caesar, but they had not removed the forces that had elevated him. The legions still existed. The expectation of strong leadership still existed. The memory of civil war still hovered, unresolved. And into this unsettled landscape, a young man began his journey toward Rome. Gaius Octavius was only 18 years old when news reached him that he had been named in Caesar's will as adopted son and principal heir. He was studying in Apollonia, in Illyricum, preparing for what might have been a modest political career under Caesar's guidance. Few in Rome had paid him serious attention, yet the will changed everything. Through adoption, Octavius became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, inheriting not only wealth, but name, prestige, and expectation. Many advised caution. The political climate was volatile. The conspirators remained influential. Mark Antony held the consulship and commanded loyalty among many veterans, but Octavian made a decision that would define his future. He accepted the adoption. He would carry Caesar's name, and with it he would enter the contest for Rome's future. When Octavian arrived in Italy in mid-44 BCE, he did so quietly. He did not possess armies. He did not command seasoned generals, but he possessed something subtle and powerful, legitimacy in the eyes of those who had loved Caesar. He began methodically. He met with veterans who had served under Caesar. He promised to honor Caesar's will, including the monetary gifts promised to citizens. When Antony hesitated to release funds from Caesar's estate, Octavian borrowed money personally to fulfill the bequests. It was a calculated gesture. By paying the people directly, he strengthened his connection to Caesar's memory. Meanwhile, Mark Antony sought to consolidate authority. As consul, he positioned himself as Caesar's political successor. He had been at Caesar's side for years, commanding troops and sharing campaigns. His experience dwarfed that of the young Octavian. At first, Antony may have underestimated him. Octavian appeared slight, youthful, untested, but he was observant, patient, and he understood the symbolic power of the name he now bore. Tensions between Antony and Octavian developed gradually. Antony had secured control over several of Caesar's documents and legislative proposals. He maneuvered to assign himself provincial commands that would grant military authority. Octavian, lacking formal office, turned to public opinion and strategic alliances. The Senate, wary of Antony's growing influence, saw in Octavian a potential counterweight. Some senators who had opposed Caesar now found themselves considering partnership with his heir, not out of affection, but out of political calculus. Rome's politics had become less about ideology and more about balance of power. In late 44 BCE, conflict began to take shape in northern Italy. One of Caesar's former supporters, Decimus Brutus, ironically also one of the conspirators, held command in Cisalpine Gaul. Antony sought to displace him and claim the province. The Senate declared Decimus Brutus lawful governor and instructed Antony to withdraw. He refused. Civil war, once again, seemed imminent. Octavian aligned himself with senatorial forces against Antony. Though still technically a private citizen, he raised troops, many of them veterans loyal to Caesar's memory. The young heir now commanded legions. The symbolism was striking. At the Battle of Mutina in 43 BCE, Antony's forces clashed with senatorial armies supported by Octavian. The fighting was intense, though measured by Roman standards of civil conflict. Both consuls of the year were killed in battle. Antony was driven back. Yet the Senate's victory was incomplete. With the consuls dead, Octavian held command of significant forces. The Senate attempted to sideline him, offering honors without full authority. Octavian responded decisively. He marched on Rome. It was not a chaotic assault. It was calculated. Faced with his legions at the gates, the Senate relented. Octavian, still barely 20 years old, was elected consul. The balance shifted again. Antony, though defeated temporarily, regrouped in Gaul. Soon, rather than continue fighting one another, Antony and Octavian would recognize a familiar truth of Roman politics. Rivalry could yield to alliance when mutual interest demanded it. The Republic, fractured and uncertain, was moving toward another concentration of power. The shadow of Julius Caesar had not faded. It had merely changed shape. By the autumn of 43 BCE, Rome had endured more than a year of instability since the Ides of March. The conspirators had scattered. Some had gathered forces in the eastern provinces. Mark Antony, though temporarily repelled at Mutina, remained a formidable commander. Octavian, astonishingly young yet politically adept, now held the consulship and commanded legions loyal to Caesar's memory. The Republic, once structured around shared magistracies and annual transitions of power, had again become an arena of military negotiation. In this unsettled landscape, an unexpected convergence began to form. Antony and Octavian, who had recently opposed one another, recognized a mutual reality. The true threat to their influence lay not between them, but among the remaining Republican forces led by Brutus and Cassius in the east. Division would weaken them both. Unity would consolidate power. And so, in November of 43 BCE, near the city of Bononia, Antony and Octavian met in person. They were joined by Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, another powerful figure who commanded troops in Gaul and Spain. The three men negotiated an agreement that would reshape Rome once more. Unlike the earlier, informal alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this new arrangement would be legalized. The Second Triumvirate was established through formal legislation, the Lex Titia. Under its terms, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus were granted extraordinary authority for 5 years to restore the Republic. The phrase carried familiarity, yet the powers granted were vast. They could appoint magistrates. They could enact laws without traditional Senate approval. They held supreme authority over military and administrative affairs. In effect, Rome was governed by 3 men. The formation of the Triumvirate marked a turning point, not simply in leadership, but in method. To consolidate control and eliminate opposition, the triumvirs resorted to proscriptions. Lists were published naming individuals deemed enemies of the state. Those listed could be killed with impunity. Their property would be confiscated. The memory of Sulla's earlier proscriptions resurfaced, now revived under new leadership. Among the victims was Marcus Tullius Cicero, the renowned orator and former consul who had vocally opposed Antony. Cicero had once been a defender of republican principle. His speeches against Antony, known as the Philippics, had been sharp and unrelenting. He was hunted down and killed. His death symbolized the closing of a generation that had tried to preserve the Republic through words rather than arms. The proscriptions were brutal in efficiency, though often framed as necessary measures to secure stability. Property changed hands, debts were settled, political rivals vanished. The triumvirate, now firmly in control of Rome, turned its attention eastward. Brutus and Cassius had gathered substantial forces in Greece. They commanded legions and enjoyed support among those who believed Caesar's death had been justified. The final contest between Caesar's heirs and Caesar's assassins approached. In 42 BCE, the opposing armies met near the town of Philippi in Macedonia. The terrain was open, bordered by marshland and hills. Autumn air carried a coolness over the assembled forces. The battles of Philippi unfolded in two phases. In the first engagement, Antony achieved significant success against Cassius's forces. Cassius, believing defeat complete, took his own life before learning that portions of his army still held ground. Weeks later, in a second confrontation, Brutus's forces were overwhelmed. Facing certain defeat, Brutus followed the path of Cassius. With their deaths, the organized republican resistance effectively ended. The triumvirs stood unchallenged. The Republic, though still named, had transformed irrevocably. After Philippi, territories were divided. Antony assumed control of the eastern provinces. Octavian governed the west. Lepidus received Africa, though his influence would gradually diminish. For a time, balance appeared restored, not in the old republican sense, but in the distribution of power among three dominant figures. Yet history rarely rests in equilibrium for long. In the years that followed, tensions would emerge once more, particularly between Antony and Octavian. Antony's involvement in Egypt and his alliance with Cleopatra would raise suspicions in Rome. Octavian, steady and calculating, would frame himself as defender of Roman tradition. But those chapters lie slightly ahead. For now, the world shaped by Julius Caesar continued to unfold. The conspirators were gone. The Republic's old guardians had fallen. And in their place, a new order was consolidating, one that would soon yield not a restored republic, but something quieter and more enduring, an empire. After the defeat of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi, the Roman world did not immediately descend into new conflict. Instead, it entered a period of uneasy partition. The Second Triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, divided authority across vast territories. The Mediterranean, once governed by magistrates of a republic, now lay effectively under the direction of three men bound by necessity rather than trust. For a time, this arrangement held. Octavian returned westward to oversee Italy and the provinces beyond. There, he faced the difficult task of settling tens of thousands of veterans on confiscated lands. Displacement caused resentment among local populations. Economic strain followed. Yet Octavian worked steadily, cultivating loyalty among soldiers while maintaining an outward image of modest service to the state. He was patient. He avoided flamboyant display. He allowed Antony, in many ways, to command the grander stage. Antony traveled east. The eastern provinces had long been wealthy, culturally sophisticated, and politically intricate. In cities such as Antioch and Alexandria, Greek traditions blended with Roman administration. It was in Egypt that Antony's path began to intertwine more deeply with Cleopatra. Our Cleopatra VII was not merely a queen of romantic legend. She was an astute political strategist, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in diplomacy, and acutely aware of Rome's power. Her alliance with Caesar had preserved her throne during earlier conflict. Now, with Caesar gone, she recognized the need for new alignment. When Antony summoned her to Tarsus in 41 BCE to answer accusations of aiding his enemies, she arrived not in humility, but in theatrical splendor. Ancient sources describe her barge adorned with rich fabrics and golden ornaments, sails perfumed, attendants dressed as figures from myth. Whether embellished or not, the image reflects careful calculation. Cleopatra understood symbolism. Antony, already inclined toward charisma and display, was captivated. Their relationship deepened, politically and personally. See, Antony spent extended periods in Egypt. Children were born to Cleopatra, whom Antony acknowledged publicly. He granted territories in the east to Cleopatra and her offspring, acts later described as the donations of Alexandria. To many in Rome, these gestures were unsettling. The East had long been viewed through a lens of luxury and excess. Roman identity prided itself on discipline and austerity, even when that image was imperfect in practice. Octavian, ever observant, recognized opportunity. He did not confront Antony directly at first. Instead, he shaped perception. Through careful messaging, he framed Antony's Eastern policies as abandonment of Roman tradition. Cleopatra, foreign and powerful, became central to the narrative. Antony was portrayed not merely as political rival, but as a man influenced by Eastern monarchy. Octavian positioned himself as defender of Rome's heritage. Meanwhile, Lepidus gradually lost influence. In 36 BCE, after a failed attempt to assert authority in Sicily, he was stripped of power and forced into quiet retirement. The Triumvirate effectively became a dual contest between Antony and Octavian. Years passed in cautious rivalry. Antony focused eastward, preparing campaigns against Parthia. His efforts met with limited success and logistical difficulty. The campaign did not yield decisive glory. Octavian consolidated the West. He strengthened Italy's loyalty, invested in infrastructure, and maintained close ties with veterans. Public opinion in Rome shifted gradually. The decisive break came in 32 BCE. Octavian obtained Antony's will, or claimed to, and read it publicly before the Senate. The document allegedly confirmed Antony's desire to be buried in Alexandria and outlined generous bequests to Cleopatra's children. Whether fully authentic or politically framed, the effect was powerful. The Senate declared war, not directly on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a subtle distinction. By framing the conflict as defense against a foreign queen rather than civil war against a Roman citizen, Octavian shaped the moral narrative. In 31 BCE, the opposing forces met near the coast of western Greece, at Actium. The setting was maritime, fleets arrayed across open waters beneath a bright Mediterranean sky. Warships maneuvered deliberately, oars cutting through blue currents. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a formidable fleet. Octavian's forces were directed largely by his capable Admiral Agrippa. The engagement unfolded cautiously at first. Ships circled, probing for advantage. Fire and boarding tactics came into play. Then, in a decisive moment, Cleopatra's fleet broke from formation and sailed southward. Antony followed. The remaining ships, leaderless, faltered. Octavian's forces secured victory. Actium did not produce the immediate drama of battlefield slaughter. It produced something quieter, the collapse of opposition through strategic retreat and fragmentation. Antony and Cleopatra withdrew to Egypt. Within a year, Octavian's forces followed. Alexandria fell in 30 BCE. Antony, facing defeat, took his own life. Cleopatra, after brief negotiation, did the same, according to tradition, by means of an asp's bite, though the exact method remains uncertain. With their deaths, resistance ended. Octavian stood alone. The long chain of events that began with Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon had now resolved into singular authority. Yet Octavian did not declare himself king. He did not claim dictatorship. Instead, he moved carefully, measured, aware of Rome's memory. In 27 BCE, he accepted the title Augustus. The republican form remained, but in substance, a new system had emerged. An empire, The rise and fall of Julius Caesar had opened the path, and now, under Augustus, Rome entered an age that would endure for centuries. With the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra and the quiet consolidation of power under Octavian, now Augustus, Rome entered a new chapter. But before the empire could fully emerge, there lingered the shadow of the man whose rise and fall had reshaped everything. Julius Caesar. Years had passed since the Ides of March. The blood had long dried upon the stones of the theater of Pompey. The conspirators were gone. The civil wars had burned themselves out. Yet Caesar's presence did not fade. It deepened. Augustus understood this well. Rather than diminish his adoptive father's memory, he elevated it. Caesar was declared Divus Julius, the divine Julius. A comet that appeared shortly after his death was interpreted as a celestial sign of his soul ascending to the heavens. Whether coincidence or cosmic symbolism, the narrative served a purpose. The man who had once been accused of aspiring to kingship was now honored as a god. A temple was constructed in his name. His image stood not only as a statesman or general, but as a divine ancestor of the ruling house. And in this transformation, we begin to understand something profound. Caesar's fall did not end his influence. It amplified it. The republic he had strained and reshaped could not return to its earlier form. The structural pressures, expanding territory, professional armies loyal to generals, economic inequality, political factionalism, remain. Caesar had not created these tensions. He had navigated them with extraordinary boldness. His crossing of the Rubicon did not invent civil war. It crystallized forces already in motion. His dictatorship did not invent centralized power. It formalized its inevitability. In many ways, Caesar was less a destroyer of the Republic and more its final expression. He embodied its contradictions. He was both aristocrat and populist, both reformer and traditionalist, both merciful and ruthless when necessary. He expanded citizenship while concentrating authority. He pardoned enemies while displacing rivals. He respected forms while altering substance. It is tempting in hindsight to search for a singular moment when Rome changed. But history rarely shifts so simply. It moves through accumulation, years of reform and resentment, moments of courage and calculation, private conversations in shaded porticos, public speeches in crowded forums. Caesar moved through all of these currents. His military brilliance in Gaul secured Rome's northern frontier for centuries. The integration of those territories would shape European history far beyond his lifetime. His calendar reform structured time itself for generations. His expansion of citizenship began a gradual transformation from city-state to cosmopolitan empire. Or yet, alongside these achievements stood the undeniable reality. His rise required civil war. His fall required assassination. His life unfolded at the hinge of Republican collapse. There is a quiet tragedy in that truth. Had he been born a century earlier, he might have been remembered as one great consul among many. Had he been born later, he might have ruled openly as emperor. Instead, he lived at the threshold, too powerful for the old system, too early for the new one. Even his death reflected this tension. The conspirators believed they were preserving liberty, yet their act unleashed forces they could not control. The republic they sought to restore did not return. Instead, it transformed, first into triumvirate, then into principate. Augustus would rule carefully, avoiding the overt titles that had alarmed senators under Caesar. He would call himself first citizen rather than king. He would maintain the Senate's outward dignity, but ultimate authority would reside with him, and this delicate balancing act Monarchy, disguised as republic, became the Roman Empire. In this sense, Caesar's greatest legacy may not be conquest alone. It may be precedent. He demonstrated that one man with legions and popular support could override senatorial resistance. He demonstrated that clemency could coexist with dominance. He demonstrated that reform could justify extraordinary authority. Augustus learned from these lessons. He avoided Caesar's visible excesses. He retained the substance of centralized control. The rise of Julius Caesar cleared the path. The fall of Julius Caesar taught caution. And from both, the empire emerged. Yet beyond politics and institutions, Caesar's name would travel even further. His family name, Caesar, became title, Kaiser, Czar. Across languages and centuries, rulers would adopt variations of his name to legitimize power. His image entered literature, drama, and philosophy. His life became symbol of ambition, of betrayal, of transformation. Even in quiet rooms centuries later, scholars would read his commentaries and observe the clarity of his prose. He wrote as he governed, directly, confidently, without ornament beyond necessity. There is something almost serene in the arc of his story. A young noble from a modest branch of an ancient family, a rising politician in turbulent times, a commander crossing rivers into mist-filled forests, a victor at Pharsalus, a reformer adjusting the calendar of the world, a dictator beneath marble columns, a man struck down in a chamber of senators, and beyond that fall, a legacy that reshaped civilization. The sun set on the Republic gradually, but its final light was refracted through the life of Julius Caesar. And even now, when we speak of turning points in history, his name returns softly to the surface. As the years passed under Augustus, Rome began to breathe differently. The sharp tension of civil war softened into structure. Roads stretched farther, provinces stabilized, trade routes grew more secure. The Mediterranean, once contested by rival fleets, settled into what later generations would call Mare Nostrum, our sea. And somewhere within that transformation, the memory of Julius Caesar became less immediate and more monumental. The young republic of earlier centuries, fragile, ambitious, fiercely protective of shared governance, had yielded to something broader, quieter, more enduring: empire. But if we step back gently and look not only at events but at patterns, we begin to see that Caesar's life was not merely a personal story. It was a story about systems under strain, about how political structures respond when they expand beyond their original design, about what happens when tradition and ambition begin to move at different speeds. Rome, in its earliest form, had been intimate, a city-state where magistrates could know the streets they governed. Authority rotated yearly, power dispersed among offices, reputation and ancestry guided advancement. But conquest changed scale. With each victory in Spain, Greece, North Africa, and Gaul, Rome accumulated wealth, land, and responsibility. The Republic grew geographically faster than it adapted structurally. The Senate was designed to guide a city. It now attempted to guide a world. And in that widening gap, individuals with vision and daring gained prominence. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and ultimately Caesar. When we imagine Caesar crossing the Rubicon, we often see a dramatic threshold, a small river under winter sky, a general pausing before destiny. But in truth, the river was only a symbol. The deeper crossing had occurred long before. It had occurred when generals first commanded legions loyal to them personally, when wealth from distant provinces outpaced the Senate's ability to regulate it, when urban crowds relied on grain distributions tied to political favor. Caesar did not invent these forces. He navigated them more skillfully than his rivals. He understood that loyalty is cultivated not only through fear, but through reward. That public perception matters as much as legal decree. That reform can secure popularity where austerity cannot. And yet, for all his calculation, he remained human. He refused Sulla's demand to divorce Cornelia in his youth. He endured capture by pirates and returned to confront them. He wrote of his campaigns in plain, steady language. He pardoned enemies when he might have destroyed them. There is complexity in him. Not pure hero, not pure villain, but something more intricate, a man aligned with his moment in history. His death, too, reveals complexity. The conspirators believed sincerely that they were defending liberty. They were not monsters acting blindly. They were senators shaped by tradition, frightened by concentration of power, convinced that removal of one man would restore balance. But history does not always reverse so neatly. Power, once centralized, rarely disperses easily. The vacuum after Caesar's death proved as destabilizing as his dominance had been, and so Rome transitioned not backward, but forward, into imperial rule under Augustus. The Republic's language remained. The Senate still met. Elections still occurred. But ultimate authority resided in one figure, carefully masked within constitutional forms. If we allow our thoughts to drift slowly across centuries, we can see how enduring this shift became. For nearly 500 years, emperors would rule the Mediterranean world. Some would govern wisely, others poorly. But the model, a singular authority above republican structure, traced its origin to the life and death of Julius Caesar. His calendar reform still shapes modern reckoning of time. His name became synonymous with ruler. His story inspired poets, playwrights, philosophers. Even today, when we speak of ambition or betrayal, echoes of his life surface quietly. Yet beyond politics and legacy, there remains something softer. Imagine Rome at dusk, the Forum gradually emptying, long shadows stretching across stone, the distant sound of sandals against pavement. In one corner stands a statue of Caesar, not the living man, but the memory carved in marble. Generations pass beneath that gaze. Children who never knew the Republic grow up under emperors. Merchants trade goods stamped with imperial seals. Soldiers march under banners bearing the eagle. Time moves forward, and the turbulence of one era becomes the foundation of another. Perhaps that is the most gentle truth history offers, that no rise stands alone, no fall exists in isolation. Each is part of a longer current. Julius Caesar rose from relative obscurity to command legions, reshape governance, and alter the course of civilization. He fell within a chamber meant to safeguard tradition, yet from that fall emerged an empire that would define the ancient world. As we step back from the noise of battles and speeches, from daggers and decrees, what remains is quieter. A city adapting, a system transforming, a name enduring. And now, as the sun lowers over the imagined hills of ancient Rome, as the Tiber reflects the last light of evening, the story settles. The streets grow calm, the Senate chamber stands silent. The marble cools beneath fading warmth. History, like the river, continues to flow. And somewhere in that steady current, the rise and fall of Julius Caesar becomes not only a tale of power, but a meditation on change itself. You can almost hear the soft murmur of the city at rest, and with it, the quiet reminder that even the greatest figures pass, but the world they shape continues on. And so we come to the end of our journey through Caesar's life and times. We have followed him from birth to death, from the crowded streets of the Subura to the theater of Pompey, from youthful obscurity to supreme power. We have seen his extraordinary talents as general, politician, writer, administrator. We have seen his ambition, his courage, his willingness to take risks. And we have seen how his very success brought about his downfall. Caesar's legacy is complex and enduring. He did not achieve his immediate goal, to reform and rule Rome. His reign as dictator lasted less than 2 years in total, much of it spent fighting civil wars. He had little time to implement his vision, whatever that vision was, and he was struck down before he could consolidate his position or establish any kind of succession. Yet Caesar transformed Rome nonetheless. His conquest of Gaul brought vast territories and millions of people into the Roman world. His military campaigns demonstrated that Rome could extend its power to the very edges of the known world. His political career showed that the old republican system could not contain a man of sufficient ambition and ability. His death and its aftermath made clear that Rome needed a new political system, one that would eventually emerge under Augustus. Caesar also left a cultural legacy. His writings continued to be read and studied. His calendar reform brought order to Rome's chaotic system of timekeeping. The month named in his honor, July, still bears his name more than 2,000 years later. His very name became synonymous with supreme power, passed down through the ages as Kaiser and Czar and Caesar. But perhaps Caesar's most important legacy was the example he provided, both inspiring and cautionary. He showed what one talented, ambitious individual could achieve, how far determination and ability could carry someone. He demonstrated that old systems, no matter how venerable, could be challenged and changed. He proved that conquest and reform were possible, that the world was not fixed, but malleable. Yet he also showed the dangers of such ambition. His concentration of power threatened the liberty of others. His reforms, however necessary, were imposed by force rather than achieved through consensus. His refusal to compromise or to accept limits ultimately cost him his life. And his death plunged Rome into further civil war, causing more suffering than his rule had prevented. The question of whether Caesar was hero or villain, savior or tyrant, has been debated ever since his death. Ancient writers disagreed. Cicero, in his private letters, admitted Caesar's brilliance but feared his ambition. Sallust praised Caesar's abilities while lamenting the Republic's fall. Plutarch presented him as a complex figure, an admirable in many ways, but ultimately too ambitious. Later writers continued the debate, each generation finding in Caesar a reflection of its own concerns about power, liberty, and leadership. In the end, perhaps the most honest assessment is that Caesar was profoundly human, neither purely heroic nor purely villainous, but a complex man whose great talents were matched by great ambitions, whose virtues were mixed with faults, whose achievements were accompanied by destruction. He changed the world, but he could not control the consequences of his changes. He sought glory and achieved it, but at a cost he perhaps did not anticipate. As we settle into the quiet of evening, as this long story finally comes to rest, we can reflect on what Caesar's life teaches us, about ambition and its costs, about power and its dangers, about how individuals shape history and are shaped by it, about the difficulty of reform and the fragility of political systems, about the enduring questions that every society must answer. How should we be governed? How much power should any individual hold? How do we balance order and liberty, stability and freedom, the needs of the present and the claims of tradition? These questions outlive Caesar. They outlive Rome. They remain with us today, as relevant in our time as in his. And perhaps that is Caesar's ultimate legacy, not the territories he conquered or the reforms he initiated, but the questions his life raises, questions that each generation must answer anew. Rest well. The story is told, and tomorrow The great wheel of history will turn again, as it always has and always will.